March 19, 1943 dawned cold and gray over the English airbase at Debden, Essex, where Colonel Don Blakesley stood watching another formation of B-17 bombers lumber into the uncertain sky. They were heading deep into Germany, and he knew too many would not return. The mathematics of aerial warfare had become brutally simple. Without long-range fighter escorts, the bombers died. The Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s ruled the skies, beyond the range of Allied fighters, turning daylight bombing missions into suicide runs. Britain's Spitfires, magnificent as they were, could barely reach the German border before their fuel tanks ran dry. America's P-47s, powerful and heavily armed, faced the same limitation. The bombers needed protection for the entire journey to targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, but no Allied fighter could provide it. In the corner of Blakesley's mind lurked a nagging thought about the new fighter that had started arriving in small numbers. The North American P-51 Mustang looked promising, but had earned a reputation as a disappointment. Designed originally for the British in 1940, it had been rushed into production to meet Britain's desperate need for fighters during the darkest days of the war. But there was a problem, one that threatened to relegate this sleek aircraft to the dustbin of failed designs. The original Mustang, powered by the Allison V1710 engine, performed beautifully at low altitudes. Test pilots praised its exceptional handling, its innovative laminar flow wing design that reduced drag, and its surprisingly long range. Yet above 15,000 feet, where modern air combat occurred, the Allison engine wheezed and struggled. The supercharger simply could not maintain power at altitude. In dogfights with German fighters operating at 25,000 feet or higher, the early Mustangs were at a fatal disadvantage. Royal Air Force squadrons had relegated them to ground attack and reconnaissance roles, dangerous work that kept them away from high-altitude combat. According to documentation preserved in the National Archives and referenced in Daniel Ford's Flying Tigers and military aviation records, the U.S. Army Air Forces had shown little interest in the Mustang initially. Commanders focused on the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive radial engine fighter that could take tremendous punishment and pack devastating firepower. The Thunderbolt was a brute, and American doctrine favored such strength. Meanwhile, the elegant Mustang gathered dust at training bases, assigned to new pilots who needed something to fly before transitioning to real fighters. But scattered across Britain and America, a handful of engineers and pilots saw something different. They looked at the Mustang's airframe and saw potential that others had missed. The aircraft's range, even with the inadequate Allison engine, exceeded anything else in the Allied inventory. Its aerodynamic efficiency was revolutionary. The laminar flow wing, designed by Edgar Schmude and his team at North American Aviation, created less drag than conventional wing designs, allowing the aircraft to fly farther on less fuel. The cockpit visibility was exceptional, with a bubble canopy that gave pilots an unobstructed view in all directions. At Rolls-Royce's facility in Derby, England, engineer Ronald Harker had test-flown a Mustang in April 1942 and immediately recognized the airframe's brilliance. He also recognized the Allison engine's fatal flaw. Harker knew Rolls-Royce had solved the high-altitude problem with their Merlin engine, the same power plant that made the Spitfire formidable. A radical idea formed. What if they married the Mustang's exceptional airframe with Britain's most successful engine? The proposal seemed almost too simple. American aircraft, British engine. Two allied nations, one revolutionary fighter. But bureaucracy, national pride, and the chaos of wartime production created obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Time was running out for the bomber crews. October 11th, 1940 brought an autumn chill to the Rolls-Royce facility at Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, where test pilot Ronald Harker prepared for a flight that would change aviation history. The prototype before him looked like any other Mustang from the outside, but beneath its cowling sat a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine, the same power plant that powered Britain's legendary Spitfire Mark 9. The marriage had been arranged hastily, almost desperately, by engineers who believed they could transform a mediocre fighter into something extraordinary. The decision to mate American airframe with British engine had not come easily. National pride complicated everything in wartime. American military planners initially resisted using foreign engines in American aircraft, seeing it as an admission of inadequacy. British officials worried about diverting Merlin engines from Spitfire and Lancaster bomber production. Yet the mathematics of war forced difficult choices. Bomber Command was hemorrhaging aircraft and crews over Germany at unsustainable rates. During the August 19, 1942 raid on Dieppe, losses had exceeded 50% for some squadrons. Without long-range escorts, strategic bombing might prove impossible. North American Aviation's chief engineer, Edgar Schmude, had designed the Mustang with exceptional attention to aerodynamic efficiency. His team had incorporated the latest laminar flow wing technology, which maintains smooth airflow over a greater portion of the wing's surface than conventional designs. This innovation reduced drag significantly, but only if the airframe remained clean and the wing's precise contours were maintained. Schmude was a perfectionist, and his obsession with reducing drag had extended to every rivet and panel joint on the aircraft. When Harker's test flight ended on that October afternoon, his report electrified both British and American aviation circles. The Merlin-powered Mustang had exceeded 400 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, maintaining power at altitudes where the Allison version had gasped for oxygen. The transformation was complete and spectacular. Furthermore, the aircraft's range exceeded even optimistic predictions. With drop tanks, the new variant could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something previously thought impossible for a single-engine fighter. Production complications immediately rose. Rolls-Royce was already operating at maximum capacity, producing Merlins for Spitfires, Hurricanes, Mosquitoes, and Lancaster bombers. They could not possibly manufacture enough additional engines for a large-scale Mustang conversion. The solution came from an unexpected source: American industry's massive production capacity. Packard Motor Company of Detroit, Michigan, had been licensed to manufacture the Merlin under the designation V1700. By late 1942, Packard's production lines were hitting their stride, producing engines that matched or exceeded Rolls-Royce quality. The engineering challenges of fitting the Packard Merlin into the Mustang airframe proved substantial. The Merlin was heavier than the Allison and required different mounting points, cooling systems, and a different propeller. North American's engineers worked around the clock, redesigning the nose section, modifying the radiator placement, and adjusting the aircraft's center of gravity. They designated the new variant the P-51B model, though British forces called it the Mustang Mark III. As reported in William Hess's comprehensive history, The Allied Fighter Aces of World War II, production began in earnest at North American's Inglewood, California facility in May 1943. The first P-51Bs started reaching operational squadrons in Europe by autumn of that year. Initial deliveries went to the 8th Air Force's fighter groups stationed in England, units that had been flying P-47s and longing for better range. The aircraft arrived in olive drab and gray camouflage, looking deceptively similar to their Allison-powered predecessors. Pilots who transitioned from other fighters to the Mustang discovered an aircraft that challenged conventions. The P-51B was lighter and less rugged than the P-47 Thunderbolt, with a liquid-cooled engine vulnerable to ground fire. But it was faster, more maneuverable, and could fly farther than any other Allied fighter in service. The cockpit layout was logical and comfortable, with controls falling easily to hand. Visibility through the bubble canopy surpassed anything pilots had experienced before. They could see their tails, their wings, above and below with minimal blind spots. December 1st, 1943 marked the day when the P-51 Mustang finally proved itself. In the cauldron of combat over Germany's industrial heartland, Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, led a formation of Mustangs escorting B-17 bombers to the city of Solingen. The mission profile was simple on paper, but terrifyingly dangerous in execution. Stay with the bombers through the most heavily defended airspace in the world. Protect them from Luftwaffe interceptors and bring everyone home. The bomber formations, each containing hundreds of flying fortresses and liberators, presented both an inspiring and heartbreaking sight. They flew in rigid box formations designed to maximize defensive firepower. each aircraft bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. Yet German fighter pilots had learned to exploit these formations' weaknesses, attacking from the sun, from below, from head-on passes that closed at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. A single cannon shell could detonate a bomber's fuel tanks or ammunition stores, turning a massive aircraft into a fireball that consumed 10 young men in seconds. Previous escort missions had followed a frustrating pattern. P-47 Thunderbolts would accompany the bombers to the German border, then turn back when fuel gauges showed halfway marks. The bombers would continue alone into Germany's interior, where Luftwaffe fighter wings waited like wolves watching a flock lose its sheepdogs. Bomber losses had sometimes exceeded 25% of aircraft dispatched, casualties that could not be sustained indefinitely. On that December mission, the Mustangs did something unprecedented. They stayed with the bombers all the way to the target and back. When Luftwaffe fighters rose to intercept, they found not abandoned bombers, but swarms of long-range fighters ready to engage. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group scored the first confirmed kill of a German fighter by a Merlin-powered Mustang, destroying a Messerschmitt Bf 109 over the Ruhr Valley. His wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, claimed a Focke-Wulf 190 moments later. The psychological impact on both sides proved as important as the tactical results. German pilots, accustomed to attacking unescorted bombers at will deep inside Reich territory, suddenly faced aggressive fighters throughout the entire mission. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland later wrote in his memoirs about the shock of encountering Mustangs over Berlin itself, something he had considered impossible based on known fighter ranges. The revelation that Allied fighters could now reach any target in Germany forced complete revision of Luftwaffe defensive tactics. American bomber crews, who had watched fighter escorts turn back mission after mission, now saw the distinctive shapes of Mustangs staying with them through the most dangerous phases of each raid. The slim fighters with their characteristic belly radiator scoop became symbols of hope to men, flying in barely heated aluminum tubes through flak-filled skies. Statistics from the 8th Air Force Historical Society show that bomber losses dropped significantly once adequate Mustang escort became routine, from over 8% per mission to under 2% by spring 1944, according to records preserved at the National Museum of the United States Air Force and documented in multiple official histories. The Mustang's success came not just from range, but from its ability to engage German fighters on equal or better terms. In dogfights, the P-51B could outturn the Bf 109 at most altitudes and nearly match the Focke-Wulf 190's roll rate. Its speed advantage at altitude allowed Mustang pilots to choose when to engage or disengage, dictating the terms of combat. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group described the Mustang as the first Allied fighter that made experienced Luftwaffe pilots cautious. Previously, German aces had pressed attacks aggressively, confident in their equipment's superiority and their own experience. Now they faced an opponent that could outfly them, outrange them, and was flown increasingly by skilled Allied pilots who had survived long enough to learn their craft. The strategic implications became clear to Allied leadership. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, accelerated Mustang production dramatically. North American Aviation's factories expanded, adding a second production line in Dallas, Texas. February 20th, 1944 brought clear skies over Germany. Perfect weather for what American airmen would call Big Week, a concentrated campaign to destroy the Luftwaffe both in the air and on the ground. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group lifted his P-51B off the runway at Bottisham, England, as part of a massive strike force heading deep into the Reich. His mission orders differed from simple bomber escort: hunt down and destroy German fighters wherever they could be found. The Luftwaffe had reorganized its defensive strategy in response to the Mustang threat. Rather than attacking bomber formations throughout their entire route, German fighters now concentrated their forces for overwhelming attacks at specific points, hoping to destroy enough bombers quickly before the escorts could react effectively. Additionally, the Luftwaffe had begun withdrawing its fighter units to bases deeper inside Germany, beyond what they believed was the Mustang's combat radius. They were wrong. Drew's flight pushed far beyond the bomber stream, penetrating to the Luftwaffe airfield at Brandenburg. German pilots, confident in their sanctuary's distance from England, had relaxed their vigilance. Messerschmitt Bf-110 heavy fighters were landing after a patrol, their landing gear down, flaps extended, at their most vulnerable moment. Drew dove on them with ruthless efficiency. In a matter of minutes, he had destroyed two Bf-110s and damaged a third, all before they could react or reach the safety of their airfield's anti-aircraft guns. This shift from defensive escort to offensive hunting marked a fundamental change in the air war's character. The Mustang's range and performance allowed new tactics. Fighter groups could now sweep ahead of bomber formations, clearing the sky of German interceptors before they could organize attacks. They could strafe Luftwaffe airfields, destroying fighters on the ground where they were helpless. They could pursue damaged German aircraft back to their bases rather than breaking off engagement. When fuel considerations forced earlier fighters to turn back, Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the Mustang's most successful practitioners of this aggressive doctrine. On August 6, 1944, during a single mission, Preddy shot down 6 German fighters, a feat that demonstrated both the Mustang's capabilities and the skill of pilots who had survived long enough to master their craft. His tactics emphasized using the Mustang's speed and altitude performance to maintain energy advantage, diving on German formations, destroying targets, then climbing away before enemy pilots could respond effectively. The Luftwaffe attempted various countermeasures. They introduced the Messerschmitt Me-60 jet fighter, which possessed speed advantage over any propeller-driven aircraft. However, the jets suffered from limited endurance, unreliable engines, and vulnerability during takeoff and landing. Mustang pilots learned to patrol near known jet bases, waiting for the German jets to land when their fuel ran low. The tactic proved devastatingly effective, and several of Germany's rare jets fell victim to Mustangs at their most vulnerable moments. German engineers developed new versions of existing fighters with enhanced performance, including the Focke-Wulf 190 Dor-9 with a more powerful engine, and the Messerschmitt Bf-100 and 9 Gustav 10 with heavier armament. These improvements helped bridge the performance gap slightly, but they could not overcome the Luftwaffe's growing shortage of trained pilots and aviation fuel. According to research documented in To Command the Sky by Stephen McFarland and Wesley Newton, by mid-1944, the average German fighter pilot had significantly less training than his Allied counterpart, a reversal from earlier war years. The loss rate among Luftwaffe pilots became unsustainable. Experienced aces who had survived years of combat found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of Allied fighters now ranging freely across German airspace. Major Erich Hartmann, the war's highest-scoring ace with 352 confirmed victories, spent increasing amounts of time and effort simply evading Allied fighters rather than attacking bombers. The predators had become prey. American fighter pilots developed almost superstitious confidence in their Mustangs. Stories circulated through fighter group ready rooms of individual pilots taking on multiple German fighters and prevailing through combination of aircraft performance and skill. Not all these stories were exaggerations. On October 12, 1944, Lieutenant Urban Drew encountered and destroyed two Messerschmitt Me-62 jets in a single engagement, demonstrating that even Germany's most advanced aircraft were vulnerable to determined Mustang pilots who understood their tactics. April 8, 1944 saw Major James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group escorting B-17 bombers to the synthetic oil refineries at Oschersleben, deep in central Germany. These facilities represented Germany's most critical vulnerability. The Reich's war machine ran on synthetic fuel produced from coal, and destroying these refineries would strangle the Luftwaffe more effectively than shooting down individual aircraft. But the refineries were among the most heavily defended targets in Europe, surrounded by flak batteries and protected by concentrated fighter forces. Howard became separated from his flight during the bomber escort and found himself alone, facing at least 30 German fighters preparing to attack the bomber formation. Rather than withdrawing to safety, Howard engaged the German force single-handedly, diving repeatedly into their formations, disrupting their attack coordination. and shooting down at least 4 fighters while damaging several others. His Mustang absorbed battle damage but continued flying, and his desperate action bought enough time for other escort fighters to arrive and drive off the remaining German attackers. Howard received the Medal of Honor for this action, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to be so honored. The oil campaign escalated throughout spring and summer of 1944. Allied strategic planners had finally recognized that Germany's synthetic fuel production represented its Achilles heel. Every other resource could be substituted or supplemented, but without fuel, tanks sat immobile, aircraft remained grounded, and Germany's war effort would collapse. The Mustang's range made this campaign possible. Refineries at Luna, Pellets, and Black Hammer lay deep inside German and Polish territory, beyond the reach of earlier escort fighters. Statistics compiled by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, referenced in official military histories, show that German aviation fuel production dropped from nearly 500,000 tons per month in March 1944 to less than 50,000 tons by September of that year. The Luftwaffe's training program virtually ceased. Experienced pilots received limited fuel allocations for combat missions. New pilots reached operational squadrons with sometimes less than 30 hours of flight training, compared to over 100 hours for American pilots arriving at combat units. The range advantage created cascading effects beyond direct combat. Mustang groups could sweep far into Germany, forcing the Luftwaffe to maintain constant alert status across huge areas. This dispersed German forces, wore down pilots and ground crews, and consumed scarce fuel simply maintaining defensive patrols. The psychological pressure of never knowing when or where Mustangs might appear eroded German morale systematically. Captain Charles Chuck Yeager of the 357th Fighter Group exemplified the aggressive ethos that characterized successful Mustang pilots. After being shot down over occupied France in March 1944 and evading capture with help from the French resistance, Yeager returned to operations with a personal vendetta against the Luftwaffe. On October 12, 1944, during a single mission escorting bombers to Bremen, Yeager shot down 5 German fighters, achieving a status in a day. His tactics emphasized violent aggression, using the Mustang's energy retention to maintain offensive initiative. The Luftwaffe attempted to husband its dwindling resources by withdrawing fighters from defensive operations and concentrating them for occasional massive attacks, intended to inflict catastrophic losses on single raids. The strategy failed repeatedly against Mustang-escorted formations. On March 6, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, throwing over 300 fighters against a bomber raid targeting Berlin. The attack resulted in German losses exceeding 80 aircraft for minimal Allied losses, a casualty rate that could not be sustained. Mustang pilots learned to exploit their aircraft's capabilities in increasingly sophisticated ways. The P-51D model, introduced in spring 1944, featured additional improvements including a bubble canopy, providing 360-degree visibility, and slightly more powerful engine. Pilots used altitude advantage to spot German formations early, coordinate attacks through improved radio communications, and employ energy tactics that maximized the Mustang's strengths while minimizing exposure to German guns. Ground attack missions became increasingly important as Allied armies advanced across Europe. Following the June 6, 1944 D-Day invasion, Mustangs transitioned easily to this role, their accuracy and long loiter time making them effective against German transportation networks, supply columns, and troop concentrations. The same range that protected strategic bombers over Germany now supported tactical operations across France, Belgium, and eventually Germany itself. September 11th, 1944 found Colonel John Meyer leading the 352nd Fighter Group deep into Poland, escorting bombers to the oil refineries at Chemnitz. The missions grew longer each month as Allied strategy demanded strikes against targets previously considered unreachable. Meyer's Mustang carried to 75-gallon drop tanks under its wings and another 85-gallon tank on the fuselage centerline, extending its already remarkable range to cover round-trip missions exceeding 1,000 miles. The psychological pressure on German pilots had become enormous. Luftwaffe fighter units now faced impossible tactical dilemmas. If they attacked the bomber formations, they exposed themselves to swarms of Mustang escorts. If they ignored the bombers, their cities and industries suffered devastating damage. If they concentrated their forces for maximum striking power, the Mustangs simply waited for German fighters to exhaust their fuel and ammunition, then attacked during their withdrawal. The tactical initiative had shifted completely to the Allies. German pilot accounts from this period, preserved in Luftwaffe historical archives and later translated in numerous scholarly works, reveal growing desperation and fatalism. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, an experienced fighter pilot with 33 victories, wrote in his diary about the psychological strain of facing overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters that seemed omnipresent. The once proud Jaguar fighter force, which had dominated European skies in 1940 and 1941, had been reduced to attempting survival rather than achieving victory. The production numbers told a devastating story. By autumn 1944, North American aviation's factories were producing over 400 Mustangs monthly, while Germany's aircraft industry struggled to replace combat losses despite heroic efforts by workers and engineers. American factories operated in complete safety, supplied with unlimited resources, staffed by well-fed workers using precision machinery. German factories suffered constant Allied bombing, chronic shortages of critical materials, and exhausted workers subsisting on inadequate rations. Mustang pilot training in the United States had evolved into a comprehensive program, producing competent combat pilots ready for operational service. New pilots arrived at European fighter groups with over 100 hours flying time, including gunnery training, formation flying, and instrument flight preparation. By contrast, German replacement pilots sometimes reached operational squadrons with less than 40 hours total flying time, including less than 10 hours in operational aircraft. They died quickly and pointlessly, easy victims for experienced Allied pilots. Colonel Hubert Zemke, transferred to command the 479th Fighter Group in August 1944, implemented aggressive tactics that maximized the Mustang's advantages. His group would sweep ahead of bomber formations at altitudes above 30,000 feet, using their height advantage to spot and engage German fighters before they could attack the bombers. The tactic proved devastatingly effective, with the 479th becoming one of the highest-scoring fighter groups. In the 8th Air Force, the air superiority campaign succeeded beyond what Allied planners had initially considered possible. By November 1944, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to ineffectiveness over most of German-controlled territory. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, commanding 8th Air Force, began releasing fighter groups from bomber escort duties to undertake independent offensive operations against ground targets. Mustang pilots strafed trains, trucks, tanks, and troop concentrations, extending the air campaign from strategic to tactical levels. According to documentation in the Army Air Force's historical studies, the 8th Air Force's fighter groups claimed over 5,000 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat between June 1944 and May 1945, with Mustang units accounting for the majority of these victories. Ground strafing added thousands more destroyed aircraft caught at airfields, plus uncounted trucks, locomotives, and other vehicles. The toll represented irreplaceable losses for Germany's collapsing war economy. Individual pilot achievements reached extraordinary levels. Major George Preddy had accumulated 26 aerial victories by December 1944, making him the top Mustang ace in Europe. December 25th, 1944 brought chaos to the Western Front as Germany launched its last major offensive through the Ardennes forest in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Bad weather had grounded Allied air power for days, allowing German forces to achieve surprise and initial success. But when the weather cleared on December 23rd, Mustang groups launched from English and French bases in overwhelming numbers to support surrounded American forces and attack German columns. Captain Ray Wetmore of the 359th Fighter Group flew multiple missions daily. During this critical period, strafe attacking German armor and supply columns caught in the open. The Mustang's ability to carry bombs and rockets while retaining air-to-air combat capability made it invaluable for these tactical missions. German forces, which had counted on continued bad weather to shield them from air attack, found themselves exposed to relentless assault from above. The Luftwaffe attempted one final grand gesture to regain air superiority. On January 1, 1945, they launched Operation Bodenplatte, throwing nearly 1,000 fighters against Allied airfields in Belgium, France, and Holland. The attack achieved tactical surprise, destroying or damaging nearly 300 Allied aircraft caught on the ground. However, the operation cost the Luftwaffe over 300 aircraft and more than 200 pilots killed or captured, including many experienced squadron and group commanders. The losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. Mustang squadrons responded with intensified offensive operations. Groups began conducting armed reconnaissance missions deep into Germany, seeking targets of opportunity and disrupting what remained of German transportation networks. Lieutenant Colonel John Landers of the 78th Fighter Group led missions that penetrated to Dresden, Prague, and Vienna, demonstrating that no location in the shrinking Reich remained safe from Allied fighters. The oil campaign reached its culmination during these winter months. Germany's synthetic fuel production had collapsed to negligible levels. Luftwaffe units received fuel allocations sufficient for only the most critical defensive missions. Training of replacement pilots virtually ceased. Some elite units retained combat capability, but the Luftwaffe as a coherent fighting force had been destroyed not primarily by combat losses, but by strangulation of its fuel supply, made possible by the Mustang's range enabling sustained attacks on distant refineries. Personal accounts from this period reveal both the triumph and tragedy of aerial warfare. Mustang pilots routinely encountered German fighters flown by inexperienced pilots who posed little threat but died nonetheless in unequal combat. Major Robin Olds, flying his first combat tour with the 479th Fighter Group, described the sadness of shooting down enemy aircraft flown by pilots who had no business being in combat with their inadequate training. The human cost of the air campaign weighed on thoughtful pilots even in victory, according to records preserved at the Air Force Historical Research Agency and referenced in official histories compiled by the Office of Air Force History. The strategic bomber offensive achieved its objectives during winter 1944-45. German war production declined sharply, transportation networks collapsed under sustained attack, and civilian morale deteriorated in the face of obvious military defeat. The Mustang had enabled this achievement by making deep penetration bombing missions sustainable, and by maintaining air superiority over German territory. April 25, 1945 saw one of the war's final significant air battles when elements of the 357th Fighter Group encountered German fighters defending Berlin's approaches. By this late date, organized Luftwaffe resistance had virtually ceased, but isolated units still fought with desperate skill. The Mustang pilots engaged and destroyed the German formation, suffering no losses themselves. Within 2 weeks, Germany would surrender unconditionally, ending the European War. The final statistics told a story of complete transformation. The United States Army Air Forces had produced more than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs in various models, making it one of the war's most numerous fighters. Mustang units claimed over 4,700 aerial victories in the European theater alone, more than any other Allied fighter type. But the numbers captured only part of the achievement. The Mustang had enabled strategic bombing to succeed by protecting bombers throughout their missions, had destroyed the Luftwaffe through attrition and fuel starvation, and had provided the tactical air power that supported ground forces from D-Day through Germany's final surrender. Colonel Don Blakesley, who had commanded the 4th Fighter Group through some of the war's fiercest air battles, flew his final combat mission on April 24, 1945. He had accumulated 15 1/2 aerial victories personally, but his greater,